Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Charles Bennett was more than just a businessman. He embodied American success. By the age of 55, he had built a thriving real estate empire in New York City, his skyscrapers and residential complexes rising proudly from the cityscape. His reputation as a tough, pragmatic, and visionary man was firmly established in the business world. Major banks vied for his investments, and the media held him up as a model of excellence and perseverance. Yet behind this mask of confidence and success lay a deep pain, invisible to the public eye, a wound that even money, power, and fame could not heal. 10 years earlier, his only daughter, 7-year-old Emily, had disappeared without a trace. That day, Charles's world had collapsed. He remembered with painful clarity that autumn morning when he had left Emily playing in the garden, a single moment of inattention that had been enough to make her disappear. The calls to the police, the frantic searches, the sleepless nights, the dashed hopes. Everything had turned into an endless nightmare. The investigators had never found a single serious lead, and the lack of explanations left an unbearable void. This unexplained disappearance had changed Charles forever. He was no longer the same man. The pain had eaten away at him to the point that he began to distance himself from the matters that had once fascinated him. Little by little, he withdrew from the spotlight, delegating important decisions to his colleagues. His fortune continued to grow, but he himself seemed to be fading. In an attempt to make sense of this immense emptiness, Charles turned to philanthropy. He wanted to transform his pain into something positive. He now devoted his time, his energy, and a significant portion of his fortune to supporting causes related to children. Orphanages, in particular, had touched him deeply. Each child he helped was, for him, a small ray of light in the darkness that enveloped him. He spent hours visiting these places, listening to the children's stories, trying to offer them a little of the stability and love he had been unable to give his own daughter. This mission gave him a reason to continue, a faint glimmer of hope that one day, perhaps, he could fill that void or, at least, prevent other families from going through what he had. One autumn morning, soft sunlight filtered through the bare branches of the trees, casting delicate shadows on the winding road leading to Hope Haven, an orphanage nestled about 100 kilometers from the city. Charles Bennett, dressed in a dark coat, drove slowly, his mind torn between the routine of this charity visit and the invisible weight of his past. Upon arrival, he was greeted by Mrs. Harper, the school's director, a woman in her 60s with impeccably coiffed silver hair, whose warm smile contrasted with the rigor of her gestures. She had known Charles for several years and had come to appreciate his commitment, however limited, to the children. "Welcome to Hope Haven, Mr. Bennett," she said gently, opening the door to the old but well-maintained building. She showed him around, showing him the dormitories, the library, the games room. Everywhere, the atmosphere exuded both simplicity and hope. Children's laughter mingled with their hurried footsteps on the worn parquet floor. Charles greeted every child he passed, exchanging a few polite smiles, sometimes a word of encouragement. But his gaze was drawn to a motionless figure in a corner of the large living room. There, seated on a small wooden armchair, a girl of about 9 seemed absorbed in thought, calm to the point of appearing almost invisible. Her brown hair waved slightly, cascading over her slender shoulders. Her face, soft and delicate, held an expression both peaceful and distant. But what struck Charles most were her eyes, large, dark, and disturbingly deep, staring into space as if searching for something only he could perceive. Mrs. Harper noticed Charles's insistent gaze and approached quietly. "Her name is Lily," she whispered with a hint of emotion. "She's been here for 2 years now. A quiet child, a little reserved, but with an inner strength that surprises those who get to know her." Charles's breath hitched. He felt his heart race as if he'd just passed through an invisible wall. Slowly, with almost reverent caution, he knelt beside Lily, trying not to upset her. "Hello, Lily," he said softly. "My name is Charles." Lily turned her head toward him slowly, as if emerging from a deep dream. Their eyes met, and a deep shiver ran down Charles's spine. That face, it was a reflection of Emily's, his daughter who had disappeared so many years ago. An image frozen in time, suddenly rediscovered, like an echo from the past. Silence fell, charged with muted emotions. Charles felt tears welling up, but he fought them back, choosing to maintain his dignity. He had finally found something he was no longer truly seeking: a connection, a promise of hope amid the chaos of his existence. In the days following his visit to Hope Haven, Charles Bennett was unable to find peace. Lily's image haunted his mind, day and night. That face, that look, it couldn't be a mere coincidence. He felt it, deep down. This child carried a fragment of his past, perhaps even a piece of his own flesh. Determined to find out more, he returned to the orphanage under the guise of making a large donation, but with a much more specific goal in mind: to discover Lily's origins. He asked to see the archives, and Mrs. Harper, sensitive to his commitment and unaware of his true intentions, confidently opened the files to him. Charles sat down in a quiet room, surrounded by old filing cabinets, yellowed papers, photocopies of social services reports, and handwritten notes. Page after page, he deciphered Lily's fragmented story. She had been found at just a few weeks old, abandoned in front of a small church in Harrisville, an unassuming town in Pennsylvania. No words, no clues, no witnesses. Just a wicker basket, a pink blanket embroidered with an L, and a pacifier attached to a worn stuffed animal. Even more disturbing, a police report stated that a witness had reported seeing a woman with a brown-haired, obviously agitated girl in a nearby park a few days before Lily's discovery. The woman's description didn't match any local mother, and the girl, according to the witness, appeared too well dressed to be the child of a runaway. This detail hit Charles like a shock wave. The date and place coincided exactly with those of Emily's disappearance. It was no longer just a hunch. There was a clue, but Charles knew that he couldn't go any further alone. He needed a professional, someone capable of delving beyond official records, reading between the lines, and unearthing buried truths. He immediately thought of Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator he had met years earlier at a charity gala. A former FBI investigator specializing in unsolved disappearances, she had left official institutions after a disagreement over a high-profile case, preferring to work freely, serving forgotten families. He contacted her immediately. "Sarah, I need you. This is personal, and it's important." The next day, they met in Charles's discreet office. He told her everything, every detail: the visit to Hope Haven, Lily's face, the archives, the testimony in Harrisville. Sarah listened to him silently, her analytical gaze letting nothing slip. "I'm going to have to dig deep, Charles. If what you suspect is true, it's going to stir up some old things. And maybe some dangerous people. Are you ready for that?" He nodded without hesitation. He was. For 10 years, he had never stopped waiting for this moment. Sarah set to work immediately. She searched Harrisville city records, discreetly interviewed former police officers, and even located the witness mentioned in the report, one Jacob Fry, now retired. The man remembered with astonishing clarity the mysterious, pale, nervous woman who held the girl's hand tightly and glanced around as if afraid she was being followed. Gradually, the name of a woman reappeared in several testimonies linked to cases of missing children: Helen Collins. Sarah discovered that Helen was known to social services as a nanny in different states. She regularly changed identities, working briefly for wealthy families and then vanishing. Each time, suspicions of abuse, kidnapping, or illegal adoptions hovered, but nothing was ever formally proven. That name, Helen Collins, appeared in at least 3 missing children files. And in 2 of them, the children had a profile similar to Emily's: young, from wealthy families, and mysteriously vanished without a trace. Sarah mapped Helen's movements over the past 15 years, cross-referencing dates and locations. And what she discovered chilled Charles's blood. Helen had been in New York City at the time of Emily's disappearance, working as a housekeeper in a house on the Upper East Side, just a few blocks from the Bennett's home. One winter evening, as Charles gazed at the cold city lights from the bay window of his apartment, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen read, "Sarah Mitchell." He picked up immediately. "Charles." Sarah's voice was strained, breathless. "I found Helen Collins. She lives alone, in an old, isolated house in the Appalachian countryside. It's her, I'm certain of it. But that's not all. There's something surprising. She often talks about a child she supposedly protected. She never wanted to say her name, but she keeps saying that she saved her from a world that was going to break her. Charles's heart raced like a drum on alert. He sat up, unable to mask the adrenaline surging through his veins. "I'm coming with you," he replied without hesitation. "Tell me where." The next day at dawn, they hit the road, driving through bare forests and snow-covered hills. The silence in the car was heavy. Sarah regularly checked her GPS, and Charles, his hands clenched in his lap, stared at the horizon, haunted by 1,000 scenarios. Was he about to discover what had really happened to Emily? Who was Lily really? And who was this woman, Helen Collins, at the heart of so many shadows? After several hours, they arrived in front of an old gray building, partially hidden behind a curtain of bare trees. The house seemed to belong to another era. The worn shutters flapped weakly in the wind, and a thin smoke escaped from the chimney. Everything exuded solitude. They got out of the car and walked to the front steps. Sarah knocked on the door. A few moments passed, then there was a rusty bolt rattling. The door slowly opened. Helen Collins appeared. She was frielier than Charles had imagined. Medium height, with matted gray hair and features drawn by the years. But her eyes were surprisingly lively, almost transparent, as if they had seen too much. She regarded them with quiet suspicion, but didn't seem surprised. "You came for Lily." His voice was raspy, but calm. A silence fell. Charles felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he murmured. Helen beckoned them in. The interior of the house was simple, almost Spartan. Books, old frames, a discreet warmth, and on a shelf, a small rag doll. The kind of toy a woman gives to a child she loves. They sat down. Sarah took out a recorder and placed it on the table, but Helen gently pushed it away. "I'll tell you the truth, but not for justice. For her." And she spoke. She told them how, 10 years earlier, she had worked as a housekeeper in a house next to Charles's on the Upper East Side. She had seen Emily several times, from a distance. A sweet, lively little girl, but surrounded by family tensions that a child shouldn't feel. One night, while walking in the park downstairs from her house, she saw a disturbing scene. A violent argument between Emily's mother, Charles's ex-wife, and an unknown man. The child was in tears. Helen, overcome by protective instinct, had moved closer. What she had heard that evening had changed everything. The child's mother threatened to get rid of Emily if she continued to cause her to lose custody or attract Charles's attention. The man, apparently the biological father of the other child, Lily, tried to calm the situation, but without success. Helen realized, horrified, that a tragedy was brewing. A few hours later, Emily had disappeared. "What I did that night," Helen said, looking Charles in the eye, "wasn't legal. I know that, but it was right. I couldn't save Emily. I was too slow, but I was able to save the other little girl. Lily, she was going to be used as a pawn. I took her, yes. I took her away from that woman, away from that danger. And I protected her as if she were my own daughter, until I got sick, and I couldn't afford to take care of her anymore. So I left her in that orphanage, where I knew she would be safe." Then she added, in a lower voice, "Lily is Emily's half-sister. Your ex-wife had an affair shortly after your separation with an abusive man. She never wanted it to be known. And Emily was probably a threat to that secret." Charles felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. This wasn't just the story of a kidnapping. It was the story of a chain of betrayals, of pain, of hidden truths. He realized that all these years, he had been ignoring part of the story, his own story. But despite the shock, a strange peace settled over him. Lily, she wasn't Emily, but she carried a part of her. A part of that broken past, but also a promise of a future. He thanked Helen, sincerely. Not with anger, not with hatred, just with gratitude. A few weeks later, after discreet legal proceedings, Charles officially adopted Lily. He brought her into his life, not as a replacement for Emily, but as a new light. He offered her love, stability, and above all, truth. And every night, watching her sleep, he finally understood. Sometimes, you don't find what you've lost, but you discover something else, which heals differently. A few months later, as winter slowly gave way to a bright spring, Charles Bennett threw a grand party at his country estate nestled in the heart of the Hudson Valley. His property, a colonial-style estate, had always been a prestigious venue, often associated with the high society gatherings of the business world. But this time, it wasn't a reception to impress investors or sign a contract. On this day, Charles was celebrating something far more precious, the rebirth of life. The garden had been decorated simply but warmly. Garlands of flowers hung between the trees, colorful tablecloths on the tables, balloons fluttering in the breeze. Everything evoked a renewed innocence. Children from several orphanages, which Charles now anonymously funded, ran along the paths, laughing and flying kites, while musicians perched under an arbor played soft melodies on violins and guitars. At the center of this tableau vivant was Lily, wearing a pale yellow dress, her hair tied back in a thin braid, running barefoot across the grass, bursting into laughter as a boy clumsily tried to catch her in a shadow play. Her gaze, once so distant, now shone with a soft, new, almost magical light. She was no longer the silent child sitting in a corner. She was a lively, fulfilled, and loved girl. Charles stood on the stone terrace, watching the scene with emotion that was hard to contain. Beside him were Sarah Mitchell, who had become a true friend since the case was resolved, and Mrs. Harper, who had left the management of Hope Haven to devote herself to providing emotional support to adopted children. Each of these adults carried a scar, a burden, but on this particular day, they all exuded the same thing: peace. Charles held a glass of lemonade in his hand, but didn't drink. He was absorbed by the image of Lily. She embodied a silent miracle. He thought of Emily, of her crystal-clear laughter, of her drawings that he still kept in a secret drawer. His daughter's absence hadn't evaporated. It never would, but it had ceased to be an abyss. Thanks to Lily, repressed love had found a way to express itself again. At one point, Lily turned to him. Their eyes met. She ran to the terrace and, without saying a word, hugged him around the waist, resting her head against his stomach. Charles, overwhelmed, placed his hands on her shoulders, leaning slowly towards her. "Are you having fun?" he asked in a muffled voice. "Yes, but I just wanted to say thank you," she murmured. He closed his eyes for a second, overwhelmed. Those simple words, coming from the mouth of a child who had never had the security of a stable home, resonated with him like a promise. Later, as the sun set, tinting the sky with pink and orange hues, Charles stepped away for a few moments. He walked to the old oak tree at the bottom of the garden, where he had installed a carved wooden bench. He sat alone. The wind still carried the sounds of children's laughter and the scent of spring flowers. He took a locket from his jacket that he always carried with him. Inside, a photo of Emily. He opened it slowly, looked at her tenderly, and said quietly, "I've never forgotten you, my darling. And I never will. But I think, thanks to her, I can breathe again." That day, Charles Bennett wasn't celebrating a victory. He was celebrating a healing process, fragile but real. He knew that the wounds of the past would never completely disappear, that they would always leave traces on his soul. But he also knew that love could rise from the ashes, that light could filter through the cracks. And in Lily's laughter, in her curious eyes and her newfound innocence, he had found a form of hope that he thought was lost forever.